Well, today we'll be saying goodbye to Nehemiah, chapter 13 of his memoirs. And you recall from last Sunday that Nehemiah had an obligation to fulfill with the king back in Susa. He had given a date that he was going to return there, and he did. And then subsequent to that, he came back to Jerusalem after a period of time that's undisclosed to us. We don't know how long that was. But when he returned back to Jerusalem, the people that he had left in such a state of revival and reform had backslidden in the major areas of their life, in their religious, in their commercial, and in their domestic areas of life. And they had good intentions and promises, and maybe this chapter was written to show that it's not just good intentions and promises, but they had desecrated the temple and allowed Ammonites and Moabites to be in the temple, and even this guy Tobiah had been given a spacious accommodation in the temple, and all of the tithes and offerings had been moved out for him to move in, and the Levites weren't supported, and so they had to return back to their fields in order to be able to supply for their families, and so the whole situation was really compromised. Well, that was last Sunday. And now we take up the reading in verse 15. In those days, I saw in Judah some who were treading the wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine and grapes and figs and all kinds of loads, and they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also men of Tyre were living there, who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, "What is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you're adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. And then I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem. Then I warned them and said to them, "Why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I'll use force against you." And from that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your loving kindness. Well, the Sabbath was profaned. Not only was the temple desecrated, but the Sabbath day profaned. And it was not just simply in Jerusalem, it was widespread. It was out in the rural areas of Judea and all. And what was their failure? Basically, they put their commerce in place of God. It was more important for them to profit than it was to obey God. And what was their promise back in chapter 10? They said, "If the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day." And they signed their name. That was Article 3 in their document, if you would. And so they had promised those things, but here they were, buying and selling on the Sabbath day. Now, the actions that Nehemiah took. First, he rebuked the offenders. And part of the reason for this rebuke is that God had warned them already that he would judge them for such actions. Jeremiah the prophet, who lived and prophesied approximately 150 years before this time right here, had these words from the Lord in Jeremiah 17, "Thus says the Lord, take heed for yourselves and do not carry any load on the Sabbath or bring anything in through the gates of Jerusalem. But if you do not listen to me to keep the Sabbath day holy and not to bear a burden and enter the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem and shall not be quenched." Now that was warning. And of course that happened. Nebuchadnezzar came, burned the gates, burned the city, destroyed it. And so here they were violating that very thing all over again when they had promised that they wouldn't. So he rebuked the offenders for that. And then he closed the gates the night before the Sabbath, and he appointed permanent gatekeepers from the ranks of the purified Levites. All of these are actions that he took. And then on top of that, these merchants were camping out right outside the wall because they couldn't come through the gates anymore. And there was the temptation for the people of Jerusalem to slip out and buy stuff outside the gates. And so he threatened the punishment of those merchants who persisted in camping outside the walls on the Sabbath. The punishment of evildoers. Now, we've got a New Testament principle here that declares to us that's the purpose of governors, at least one of the purpose of governors, to punish evildoers. Peter tells us that in 1 Peter 2. So they not only desecrated the temple, but they profaned the Sabbath day. Well, we go on from there. We see that's not even the last of it. In verse 23, we see the sanctity of marriage was profaned. He starts 23 out the same way he started 15 out, in those days. In those days I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod and Ammon and Moab. And as for their children, half of them spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them, and cursed them, and struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, "You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves." Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you that you've committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God and marrying foreign women? Well, here's the practice, again, surfacing, of marrying foreign wives. And Malachi, who was a prophet, seems to be, at least most of the commentators believe, that he was a contemporary of Nehemiah, at least after the exile, a prophet after the exile, and he spoke in his oracle of Malachi about the the Jews that were divorcing a Jewish wife to marry a foreign one. And he spoke about how that was violating God's whole design, which was a godly offspring. He says in Malachi 2 and verse 15, "Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth." That's what Malachi said. A contemporary of Nehemiah, at least in this time frame. And so it just goes to show you that the prophets were prophesying against this very thing, and Nehemiah returns and discovers that's going on. And who were they marrying? They were marrying women from the enemies of Israel. We already saw what Ammon and Moab did to Israel and what their roots were, and how they were a thorn in the side of the Israelites. And then women from Ashdod, that's Philistine territory, over in that direction. And so they were marrying in and establishing these connections with the enemies of God. And so what did Nehemiah do there? Well, he rebuked the offenders at first, admonished them, reprimanded them, warned them. He rebuked them. And then he pronounced a curse on them. I think that's what that means right there, and cursed them. It's not that he used profane language against them or something like that. I believe it's a curse along the lines of, "May God do this to you if you allow that to happen." Pronounced a curse on them. And it's similar to the 5th chapter of Nehemiah, where he shook out the front of his garment and he said, "Thus may God shake out every man from his house and from his possessions who does not fulfill this promise." That kind of a curse. And he contended with them. He got violent with some. And I don't know what to make of all of this, except that Nehemiah is probably not to be imitated exactly in the details of all of this, maybe imitated in his zeal for the Lord and the things of God. But he got violent with some, striking them and pulling out their hair. Vehement zeal. It kind of reminds me of the Lord Jesus when he cleared the temple. Remember, he made a whip out of cords, turned over tables, and drove them out with a whip out of the temple. He did that on 2 occasions, one at the start of his ministry and one at the end of it, and said, "You've made my Father's house a den of thieves." It's supposed to be a house of prayer. There was vehement zeal, and whether or not Nehemiah was right in it, we can't say, but we can say the Lord was. He was right in everything that he did. It kind of reminds me of Moses throwing down and breaking the tablets that the law of God was written with the finger of God on, those tablets. And when Moses came down from the mountain and the Israelites were involved in all of that idolatry, that scene there around the golden calf, he threw those tablets down and broke them, and God never reprimanded him for that. He was banned from Canaan because he struck the rock twice instead of once, but here he smashes the tablets with the 10 Commandments on there in vehement zeal against the sin that it was going on, and God didn't punish him for that. I don't know what to make of all of that. It reminds me also of Phinehas. You remember? In the days when the women of Moab were incited under the advice of Balaam to entice the men of Israel, cause the men of Israel to sin. That was going on, and here right in the camp, right in front of everybody, a Hebrew man takes a Moabite woman, goes into the tent, and Phinehas takes a spear, goes in there with him and runs them both through with the spear. Nothing happened to Phinehas. In fact, God praised him for that. And in his vehement zeal, the plague was stopped because he did it. So I don't know what to make of all of this. I can't put a spin on it. But nonetheless, it's recorded here in all of its in all of its raw nature. Nehemiah contended with them, cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair and made them swear. And he reasoned with them, citing the case of Solomon. Well, if that weren't enough, the desecration of the temple and the profaning of the Sabbath day, and then now the sanctity of marriage profaned, the priesthood was defiled. Verse 28, even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashim the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, so I drove him away from me. So the priesthood is defiled. Here's this guy that's a grandson to the high priest, Eliashib, yet because he had married a daughter of Sanballat, who was not only a foreigner, but the daughter of a persistent enemy. Again, remember, it was always Sanballat and Tobiah and Sanballat. Remember those two guys when the wall was going up? Well, here this grandson of the high priest married a daughter of Sanballat. Sanballat is the guy that said, "What are these feeble Jews doing?" Remember that when he mocked? And Tobiah was the one that said, "Yeah, if even a fox climbs up on that wall, he'll break it down." And here you have Tobiah occupying a place in the temple, and you have the high priest, Eliashib's grandson, marrying Sanballat's daughter. It would make a man mad enough that he would strike some of them and pull out their beards. So Nehemiah says, I drove him away from me. Well, these marriages, marriages between a believer and an unbeliever, it would be the New Testament version of it here, and being unequally yoked. And it's so unadvisable and so against the ways of God that the closeness of marriage is impossible with such a difference in states between the two. And the children are negatively affected. Mothers typically have more influence on their children. They have more time with them. But here, the children half spoke the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. And so what happened with the godly offspring? So the priests and the Levites, they could speak Hebrew. The scriptures were written in Hebrew. But here are children that don't understand it. So how can they benefit? And they come as a result of this unholy marriage. And there's little doubt that the mothers would also have taught their children about their own gods. So it's quite a compromise. And then there's genuine danger to the soul with this compromised union. Nehemiah lists Solomon, and he lists him in his great advantages and his privileges. He says there was no king like him. And he says he was loved by God. The word tells us back in 2 Samuel 12 that Nathan the prophet was sent by God with a name. And it was other than Solomon, it was Jedediah. And you know what that name means? Beloved of the Lord. So God named Solomon that, beloved of the Lord, made him king over all of Israel, and blessed him with that immense blessing of being more wise than anyone that had come before him and more wise than anyone that would come after him. Literally the wisest man that ever lived. He had all of those advantages. Yet we're told, yet the foreign women caused even him to sin. In the account in 1 Kings 11, Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. So he went after all of these, and it's actually categorized there in 1 Kings 11. So that's a real warning. Even those who are successful and have all the advantages of Solomon can fall into alarming sin. Well, these are the things that have happened since Nehemiah was gone away to Susa. All of these compromises and all of these backslidings and the very things that they had promised they wouldn't do, signed the documents. So that's not a very good picture, is it? But I'm thankful. After each one of these, Nehemiah prays, remember me, oh my God. So he says in verse 30, thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. It's quite an ending to the memoirs of Nehemiah, remember me. Well, in wrapping it up, I want to highlight some things about Nehemiah himself. We've gone through 13 chapters of his memoirs. It seems like there's some good things to draw from Nehemiah the leader. Nehemiah was not a prophet, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a king, he was an appointed governor. And he was appointed as governor and an instrument in the hand of God, raised up for such a time as he lived in. And God does that. God did it. He did it in the case of Zerubbabel, in the days of Ezra. He raised up Zerubbabel to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. He raised up also two prophets, Zechariah and Haggai, to preach to him. And why did he do that? He did it because 70 years were up, and it was time. In God's faithfulness, God raises up men for occasions and forges them and produces them to accomplish his purposes, the providence of God. And that prophet Zechariah to Zerubbabel, it's amazing, but it would cause any man to want to serve God whenever he had a prophet tell him, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. And when he went on to say, what are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you'll become a plain. And he'll bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace to it. God does that in his providence. He did that for Nehemiah. Nehemiah was raised up to bring the people back to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall. Nehemiah had moral and spiritual integrity. I mean, by that, the rule of his life was what is right in the sight of God. And it was not just theory. He had a practical fear of God that influenced him. You remember back in chapter 5 where he was talking about the previous governors over the people of Judea. He said, even their servants domineered the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. God ruled in his life, in the practical areas of his life. He had great confidence in God. He said, the king granted them to me because the good hand of my God was on me. And he said, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. Remember those famous quotes? He said, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who's great and awesome, and fight. He had great confidence in God. He said, this work has been accomplished with the help of our God. He was a man of prayer. In chapter 1, at the very beginning, we see, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And then when the king asked him, what would you request? I prayed to the God of heaven. And then in chapter 4, hear, O our God, how we are despised. And then later, we prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. You recall these. I'm just flashing back and saying, this is the man, Nehemiah. He was a man of prayer. And then several different places, remember me, O my God, for good. In chapter 6, O God, strengthen my hands. And in chapter 6 also, he prayed against his enemies. Remember, O my God, Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these works of theirs. So he was a man of prayer. And as a leader, he was a man of genuine character. There was nothing indecisive about this guy, nothing effeminate. He was strong. He was a leader. In chapter 4, none of us removed our clothes. Each took his weapon, even to the water, sleeping with their clothes on. And then in chapter 5, I also applied myself to the work on this wall. He got right in there. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't just a guy standing back saying, you guys do all of this. He got right in there and helped. So as a leader, he had that genuine character. He was not effeminate. He was a man's man. He was courageous. Should such a one as I flee? That's courage. He said earlier on in this chapter, it was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. That took courage to do that. And he told them back earlier in his account of the wall being built, he said to some, you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. He was courageous. He was a man of foresight. He asked the king for timber from the king's forest for the gates and the beams as they put up the wall. He surveyed the walls on a secret midnight ride. Remember that? He was a man of foresight. He was a man with wisdom and discernment. He could see through the plot of the enemies, he says, but they were planning to harm me. He could see through it. There was a prophet that came to him, a false prophet, who said, they're coming to kill you at night. You better flee into the temple. You recall that? He says, then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, but he was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly and sin. So he had this high level of discernment and wisdom. He wisely delegated responsibility. He appointed 4 men to be treasurers. They were considered reliable. And he posted sanctified Levites at the gates, the gate posts we read today. In another place, he put Hananiah, my brother, and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, in charge of Jerusalem, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. He was wise. He said, "Do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they are standing guard, let them shut and bolt the doors at night." Wise. He repopulated Jerusalem. Remember the drawing lots? 1 out of every 10 of the rural people come and live in Jerusalem to repopulate the city. That was smart. That was wise. Wise actions. He was a skilled organizer, and that's very valuable. Anytime you have one of those or two in your church, I mean, the sections of the wall were assigned to people in front of their houses and at different places. The choirs at the dedication, he arranged all of that. Remember the 2 big choirs? One went this way, one went that way, and they met up at the temple. I appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task. He was an organizer and a manager. I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times. I'm thankful for that. It wasn't haphazard. He was organized. He was impartial. We could say that. He rebuked wealthy men, rulers, priests, as well as the common people. He wasn't afraid that way. He was impartial. His self-denial was exemplary. Back in chapter 5, he says, "For 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance." Self-denial. "But the former governors who were before me took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver." But Nehemiah didn't do that. He knew the scriptures. He knew the history contained in the scriptures. Was aware of the sins of the fathers. And, like today, the sins of Solomon and his failures. He said in one place, "Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city?" Back in verse 18. He was a sympathizer for the oppressed. Back in chapter 5, there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against Jewish brothers. "We're mortgaging our fields," they said, "and our vineyards and our houses so that we can get grain, and we're forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and we're helpless because of our fields and our vineyards. They belong to others." There were people that were oppressing the poor and demanding their property from them and putting them in a terrible position financially. Nehemiah says, "I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words." And his conclusion, "Let abandon this exacting of interest and give back this very day their fields." He sympathized with the oppressed. He was zealous for the ways of God. We saw some of that vehement, zealous jealousy for the ways of God. "Why has God's house been neglected?" he said. "And I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room." Reminds me of Jesus clearing the temple. He was a man of action. He didn't just talk. He wasn't content simply with warnings alone. He confronted and rebuked and challenged, and then he took immediate practical steps toward reformation. He had the ability to inspire others. "Then I said to them," in chapter 2, "You see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." And they said, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthened their hands for the good work. He was a motivator that way. He had the ability to inspire others. And then lastly, he was a man of joyous celebration. His was not a morose religion. in chapter 8, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep." For all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. That was not Nehemiah. It was the joy of the Lord as your strength. He said, "Go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing, for this day is holy to your Lord. And do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." And as a result, all the people went away to eat and to drink and to send portions and to celebrate a great festival, because they understood the words which had been made known to them. So he was a man of joy, joyous celebration, and not morose religion. Well, that sums up some thoughts that I had on Nehemiah, the leader. We need more men like this. Did that kind of come across your mind as you were hearing some of these things and recollecting? Nehemiah, we need more men like this in high places, places of leadership. And so it produces for us an opportunity to pray that God would raise up such men for his service at home and abroad, all over the world scene. For such a time as this. Well, that's Nehemiah. We say goodbye to him. And that's all that I have for today.